The history of Halliburton is a list of disasters. It started in the dangerous oil fields of Oklahoma and spread across the globe. This company follows war and catastrophe. Look at the evidence. In Vietnam, they profited from the escalation of war. In Iraq, they held massive contracts while soldiers were electrocuted by their shoddy electrical work. In the Gulf of Mexico, their failure at Deepwater Horizon entombed 11 men underwater. They survive every scandal. They keep making money. Halliburton thrives exactly where others die. How did the Iron Man build an empire on dead bodies? The origins of the Halliburton empire are forged in the high-risk, high-body count environment of the early American oil boom. The Wild West of the 1910s was not fought with six-shooters, but with steam drills and nitroglycerin. It was a world where wildcatters descended on dusty towns in Texas and Oklahoma, erecting wooden derricks that frequently exploded, crushing the roughnecks working beneath them, or incinerating them in geysers of burning oil. Into this landscape of mud and danger stepped Earl Palmer Halliburton, a man who would become the Iron Man of the oil patch, and whose own life would be defined by a relentless drive that ultimately led to a premature and violent end. Born in 1892 on a poor farm in Tennessee, Earl Halliburton was a man intimately acquainted with the fragility of life. His father died when Earl was just 12 years old, leaving the family destitute. This early brush with mortality and poverty instilled in Early a ferocious, almost desperate work ethic. He left home as a teenager, drifting through the brutal labor markets of the early 20th century. He worked on ships, he worked on railroads, and eventually in 1916 he found his way to the oil fields of California. It was there, working for the Perkins Oil Well Cementing Company, that Earl saw the killer in the industry. Oil wells in the early days were notoriously unstable. As drillers punched into high-pressure reservoirs, water would often seep in, ruining the well, or worse, the pressurized gas would blow the drilling tools out of the hole, a blowout. These blowouts were catastrophic. They killed men instantly, decapitating them with flying steel or burning them alive. Early Halliburton had an idea. He believed that by mixing cement and pumping it down the well around the casing, he could seal the well, preventing water intrusion and, crucially, stopping the blowouts. It was a technology designed to tame the violence of the earth, but Earl was arrogant, abrasive, and difficult. He was fired by Perkins in 1919. He moved to Burkburnett, Texas, the heart of a new oil boom, with nothing but a wagon, a team of mules, and a borrowed pump. He founded the New Method Oil Well Cementing Company. The early years were a physical war. Earl and his wife, Vida, lived in a tent on the oil fields. Vida washed the cement-caked clothes of the crew by hand. Early worked 20-hour days, physically fighting with drillers who didn't believe in his new method. He was a brawler. He carried a gun. He operated in a lawless environment where disputes were settled with fists. But his method worked. In 1920, a massive wildcat, well, the Skelly number, 1, threatened to blow out. It was a widowmaker well. Earl Halliburton stepped in, pumped his cement, and killed the pressure. The well was tamed. The legend of Halliburton was born. By the mid-1920s, the new method had become the Halliburton Oil Well Cementing Company, Howco. Earl patented his jet mixer, a device that could mix cement fast enough to keep up with the pumps. He built a fleet of trucks. He became a millionaire. However, the wealth was built on a foundation of extreme hazard. The men who worked for Halliburton, the cementers, had one of the most dangerous jobs in America. They worked with high-pressure pumps, toxic chemicals, and heavy machinery on slippery, oil-soaked rig floors. Accidents were common, fingers were lost, Bones were broken and men died. Earl Halliburton viewed these casualties with the cold detachment of a general. He paid his men well, but he demanded absolute military-style obedience. He was a union buster who crushed any attempt by his workers to organize for safer conditions. He believed that safety was a personal responsibility, not a corporate one. As the company grew in the 1930s and 40s, Earle became an industrial titan. He bought planes to fly between rigs. He expanded into South America and the Middle East, but his personal life was marked by the paranoia of the nouveau riche. He built a fortress-like home in Los Angeles, complete with secret passages. He trusted no one but his family. But Earl P. Halliburton, the founder, did not live to see the future transformation of his company. By 1957, at just 65 years old, the Iron Man was failing. He died in Los Angeles from respiratory complications, leaving behind a family unprepared to wield the power he had created. His death marked the end of the heroic era of wildcatting. The Halliburton family retreated into the background, leaving a power vacuum that would soon be filled not by oilmen, but by political fixers. The stage was set for a dark evolution, profiting from war and torture. The death of the founder, Earl P. Halliburton, in 1957, marked the end of the company's era of heroic industrialism. The iron-willed wildcatter who had personally fought blowouts on the rig floor was gone, leaving behind a power vacuum that would be filled not by oilmen, but by political fixers. The Halliburton family heirs, Earl Jr. and his siblings, retreated into the background, content to cash their dividend checks while professional managers steered the company toward a new, darker source of revenue. In 1962, 5 years after Early's death, the corporation executed a merger that would fundamentally alter its DNA, transforming it from an oil services firm into a paramilitary construction giant. Halliburton acquired Brown & Root. Brown & Root was a Texas construction firm with a reputation that was less about engineering and more about patronage. Run by the brothers Herman and George Brown, the company had served for decades as the primary financial engine for the political career of Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. The relationship was symbiotic and corrupt. The Browns funded LBJ's rise from congressman to senator to vice president, and in return, LBJ steered massive federal contracts, dams, highways, and naval bases to Brown & Root. It was a patronage machine operating in plain sight, a precursor to the modern military-industrial complex. When LBJ ascended to the presidency in 1963, following the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Halliburton, via its new Brown & Root subsidiary, effectively became the private construction arm of the White House, and LBJ had a war to fight. As the United States escalated its involvement in Vietnam in 1964 and 1965, the Pentagon faced a logistical crisis. They needed to build a massive infrastructure, deepwater ports, jet-capable airstrips, barracks, and prisons in a dense, hostile jungle thousands of miles from home. The Navy's construction battalions were overwhelmed. LBJ turned to his old friends. In 1965, Brown & Root was named the lead partner in a consortium known as Remke-BRJ, nicknamed the Vietnam Builders. They were granted a virtual monopoly on military construction in South Vietnam. The contract was a masterpiece of war profiteering. It was a cost-plus arrangement. This meant that the government reimbursed Halliburton for all its expenses, labor, materials, transport, and then paid a guaranteed profit percentage on top of those costs. Under this perverse system, there was zero incentive to be efficient. In fact, the more money the company wasted, the more profit it made. If a generator cost $1,000, they made a percentage. If they paid $10,000 for the same generator, they made 10 times the profit. Waste was not a flaw. It was the business model. The scale of the operation was biblical. By 1967, Halliburton employed over 50,000 workers in Vietnam, a mix of American managers, South Korean laborers, and local Vietnamese. They poured millions of tons of concrete, dredged harbors, and built air bases like Tan Son Nhut and Da Nang. But the cost of the cost-plus contract was not just financial, it was human. The construction sites were dangerous, chaotic zones. American civilian contractors worked alongside soldiers, often under mortar fire. The accident rate was horrific. Men were crushed by earth movers in the mud, electrocuted by hastily wired generators, or killed by tropical diseases. The company treated these casualties as line items. The bodies were shipped home, the insurance claims were filed, and the concrete kept pouring. The darkest chapter of Halliburton's Vietnam legacy involved the construction of the Con Son Island prison. The South Vietnamese government used Con Son to hold political prisoners and Viet Cong suspects. It was a torture center. In 1970, a U.S. congressional delegation discovered the existence of the tiger cages. These were brutal stone pits with iron grates on top where prisoners were kept in subhuman conditions. Guards would beat them with sticks from above and pour lime and water down on them, burning their skin and eyes. Investigations revealed that Brown and Root contractors had built the infrastructure that facilitated this torture. They had constructed the new cells, the interrogation rooms, and the isolation blocks. The company argued they were simply following orders to build detention facilities. But the moral stain was indelible. When the tiger cages were exposed, it sparked global outrage. The Halliburton name, through Brown and Root, became a symbol of American complicity in war crimes. Anti-war protesters in the United States began to target the company. They branded it Burn and Loot. They marched outside the headquarters, carrying signs that read, Halliburton kills. But inside the boardroom, the mood was jubilant. The Vietnam War had generated billions of dollars in revenue. The company had proven that war was recession-proof. Even as the U.S. military lost the war on the ground, Halliburton won the contract on the balance sheet. As the last helicopters lifted off the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon in 1975, Halliburton retreated back to Texas, flush with cash but stained with a permanent moral rot. They had learned a dangerous lesson that would guide them for the next 30 years. The Pentagon relies on private contractors, and in the fog of war, accountability is the first casualty. As the smoke cleared from the battlefields of Vietnam in the mid-1970s, Halliburton pivoted back to its foundational business, oil. The geopolitical chaos of the era, specifically the Iranian Revolution and the subsequent energy crises, created a gold rush in the American oil patch. For a few heady years, the company could do no wrong. The price of oil skyrocketed, and with it, the demand for Halliburton's cementing and drilling services. The company expanded aggressively, hiring thousands of new roughnecks, building sprawling campuses in Houston and Duncan, Oklahoma, and generating wealth that flowed back to the Halliburton family heirs, Earl Jr., and his sisters, who lived lives of quiet, detached luxury, insulated from the grime of the rigs. But the curse of the industry is its volatility, a boom and bust cycle that treats human workers as disposable ballast. In 1982, the bottom fell out. The oil bust was a catastrophic economic collapse that devastated Texas and Oklahoma. Oil prices plunged and drilling stopped overnight. Halliburton's response to the crash was a brutal exercise in corporate survivalism. To protect the dividends of the shareholders and the family heirs, the management executed one of the largest mass firings in American industrial history. Between 1982 and 1986, Halliburton laid off nearly 70,000 employees. This was not just a downsizing, it was a social massacre. Entire towns in the oil patch were hollowed out. Men who had given their bodies to the company were discarded without severance. Their pensions vaporized, their homes foreclosed. The suicide rate in the oil-producing states spiked. This was economic violence, a different kind of body count than the one in Vietnam, but one that left deep, lasting scars on the American working class. In this atmosphere of desperation and cost-cutting, the safety culture of the entire oil services industry began to erode. To survive the lean years, companies cut maintenance budgets, extended shifts, and ignored warning signs. This culture of negligence set the stage for a series of industrial disasters that would haunt the sector. While Occidental Petroleum bore the primary responsibility for the Piper Alpha disaster in the North Sea in 1988, where 167 men died, Halliburton was deeply embedded in the same lethal ecosystem. Halliburton was a key contractor on the rig, providing pumping and cementing services. The disaster was a grim reminder that the oil field was an unforgiving environment where a single cut corner could lead to a holocaust. For the Halliburton heirs watching from afar, Piper Alpha was a business interruption. For the families of the dead, it was proof that the industry viewed their lives as the cost of doing business. As the 1980s dragged on, Halliburton struggled to regain its footing. It was a wounded giant, bloated with debt and lacking a strategic vision. The professional managers who ran the company were competent technocrats, but they lacked the political muscle to secure the truly massive government-backed contracts that had fueled the Vietnam-era boom. The company was drifting. By 1990, with the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, on the horizon, Halliburton's leadership realized they were missing out. They watched as the U.S. military deployed to Saudi Arabia, but Halliburton did not have the inside track it once enjoyed under LBJ. They needed a new patron. They needed a man who could merge the corporation with the Pentagon. They spent the early 1990s searching for this figurehead. They flirted with various retired generals and politicians, looking for someone with the right mix of ruthlessness and connections. The company's stock was stagnant. They needed a game changer. In 1993, the search committee zeroed in on a candidate who seemed almost too perfect. He was not a businessman. He had never drilled an oil well in his life. He was a career bureaucrat from Wyoming, a man with a history of heart attacks and a reputation as the ultimate Washington insider. He had just finished a term as the Secretary of Defense, where he had successfully managed the Gulf War media cycle and overseen the restructuring of the U.S. military. His name was Dick Cheney. The courtship was quiet and intense. Cheney was looking for a golden parachute after his years in public service. Halliburton was looking for a key to the Treasury. In 1995, the deal was struck. Dick Cheney was named chairman and CEO of Halliburton. The hiring of Cheney was the turning point. It marked the definitive end of Halliburton as a mere company and its rebirth as a political machine. The employees in the oil fields of Texas didn't know it yet, but their new boss wasn't interested in the geology of the Permian Basin. He was interested in the geography of American power. He was about to take them on a journey that would lead from the boardrooms of Dallas to the burning pits of Iraq, and he would do it with a cold-blooded efficiency that early Halliburton himself might have admired, even as he recoiled from the consequences. When Dick Cheney arrived in Dallas in October 1995 to take the helm of Halliburton, he brought with him a philosophy that would fundamentally rewrite the rules of American warfare. Cheney was not interested in the traditional dirty work of drilling for oil. He viewed that as a commodity business subject to the whims of the market. He was interested in a monopoly. He understood from his years as Secretary of Defense that the United States military was undergoing a silent crisis. The post-Cold War downsizing had stripped the Pentagon of its logistical tail. The Army could still fight, but it could no longer feed, house, or transport itself for sustained periods without help. Cheney positioned Halliburton to be that help. His strategy was the total privatization of military logistics. He aggressively expanded the scope of a contract vehicle known as LOGCAP, Logistics Civil Augmentation Program. Under Cheney's watch, Halliburton's subsidiary, KBR, Kellogg Brown and Root, transformed LOGCAP from a bureaucratic backwater into a multi-billion-dollar revenue stream that effectively made the company the fourth branch of the armed services. The testing ground for this new model was the Balkans. In 1995, as President Clinton deployed U.S. troops to Bosnia and later Kosovo to stop the ethnic cleansing, Halliburton went with them. But this was not the Seabees of World War II building temporary huts. This was a corporate invasion. KBR built massive permanent cities for the soldiers, most notably Camp Bondsteel in Kosovo. It was a sprawling fortress with fast food franchises, gyms, and air-conditioned barracks, all built and run by private contractors. The cost-plus nature of these contracts meant that fiscal discipline was non-existent. Every burger flipped and every toilet scrubbed generated a guaranteed profit for the company, but the moral discipline was also rotting. In the lawless vacuum of the post-war Balkans, Halliburton's subcontractors operated with near total impunity. Whistleblowers began to report a culture of excess and exploitation. There were allegations of massive overcharging, billing the government for ghost employees, and undelivered supplies. Even darker were the reports of human trafficking. While KBR itself denied direct involvement, the contractor ecosystem they managed in the Balkans became a hub for the sex trade. Investigations by human rights groups and later by the government revealed that employees of contractors working alongside KBR were frequenting brothels filled with trafficked women from Eastern Europe. The company's response was to hide behind the subcontractor shield, arguing they couldn't police the private lives of every worker. It was a preview of the plausible deniability that would define the company's future in Iraq. Profit from the chaos, but take no responsibility for the sins committed in the shadows. While Cheney was privatizing war in Europe, he was simultaneously attempting to corner the market on oil services at home. He wanted Halliburton to be the undisputed giant of the energy sector, a company so large it could dictate terms to nations. In 1998, he engineered his masterpiece deal, the acquisition of Dresser Industries. Dresser was Halliburton's main rival, a massive conglomerate in its own right. Cheney bought it for $7.7 billion. On Wall Street, the merger was hailed as a stroke of genius. It consolidated the industry and eliminated competition. Cheney was celebrated as a titan of business, but in his rush to close the deal, the master strategist had made a catastrophic, lethal error. He had failed to look in the basement. Dresser Industries carried a dormant virus in its corporate DNA. Decades earlier, it had owned a subsidiary called Harbison Walker, which manufactured industrial refractory bricks and pipe insulation. The primary ingredient in those products was asbestos. Cheney's due diligence team had underestimated the threat. They believed the asbestos claims were manageable, a minor line item. They were wrong. By 1998, the legal landscape of America was shifting. Asbestos litigation was exploding. The moment Halliburton absorbed Dresser, it absorbed the liability for every single lung fiber Dresser had ever poisoned. Almost immediately after the ink dried on the merger, the concrete coffin slammed shut. The number of asbestos lawsuits filed against the new combined company skyrocketed. It wasn't hundreds, it was hundreds of thousands. The potential liability was not millions, it was billions. The stock market reacted with fury. Halliburton's share price collapsed, losing nearly 50% of its value in a matter of months. The Cheney premium evaporated. The acquisition that was supposed to secure the company's future had instead strapped a suicide vest to its balance sheet. Cheney had bought a cancer. As the year 1999 turned into 2000, the pressure inside the Dallas headquarters was suffocating. The asbestos claims were draining cash at a terrifying rate. The shareholders were in revolt. The war machine was sputtering. Cheney needed an exit strategy. He needed a way to leave the burning building before the roof collapsed, and he needed a landing spot that was immune to shareholder lawsuits. Fate, in the form of the 2000 presidential election, provided the parachute. When George W. Bush asked Cheney to lead the search for a vice president, and then eventually asked Cheney to be the vice president, it was the ultimate failing upward. In July 2000, Dick Cheney resigned as CEO of Halliburton, but he did not leave empty-handed. Despite the asbestos disaster he had engineered, despite the stock crash, and despite the ethical clouds over the Balkans, the board of directors, men Cheney had appointed, awarded him a severance package that was nothing short of looting. He received a retirement package valued at roughly $36 million. He was allowed to keep unexercised stock options worth millions more. And, in a detail that would become a political lightning rod, he was granted a deferred compensation salary that would continue to pay him hundreds of thousands of dollars a year while he was sitting in the White House. As Cheney walked out the door in late 2000, heading for the campaign trail, he left behind a company that was structurally broken but politically primed. He had loaded it with debt and asbestos liability, but he had also positioned it as the sole logistical provider for the U.S. Army. He knew, better than anyone, that if the Republicans won the White House, the peace dividend would be over. There would be new wars. And Halliburton, his creation, would be the only company capable of fighting them. The departure of Dick Cheney in July 2000 left Halliburton in a state of suspended animation, a colossus holding its breath. The asbestos liability from the Dresser Industries acquisition was a financial cancer that was metastasizing daily, with lawsuits piling up in courts from Texas to Pennsylvania. The stock price continued its downward spiral, wiping out the retirement savings of employees who had been loyal for decades. But inside the executive suites in Dallas, the mood was not one of panic, but of calculated anticipation. The company's former CEO was now on the Republican ticket. If George W. Bush won the election, Halliburton would have a friend in the highest office in the land. This political bet paid off in November 2000, when the Supreme Court decided the election in favor of Bush. As Cheney prepared to take the oath of office as vice president, Halliburton was quietly finalizing the infrastructure for the next phase of its existence. The war machine was fully assembled. KBR, its engineering arm, held the log cap contract, giving it a monopoly on Army logistics. The Oil Services Division, despite the asbestos drag, was still the dominant player in the Middle East. The company was a coiled spring, waiting for a trigger event that would unleash its full potential. That trigger was September 11th, 2001. When the planes hit the towers, the geopolitical landscape that Cheney had predicted and Halliburton had prepared for became reality. The peace dividend era ended in a fireball. The United States was going to war, and it was going to do so with a military that had been hollowed out and privatized. The Pentagon no longer had the capacity to feed its own troops, build its own bases, or transport its own fuel. It needed a contractor. And there was only one company with the scale, the security clearance, and the political connections to do the job. In the chaotic months of late 2001, as U.S. Special Forces deployed to Afghanistan, KBR was right behind them. They built the forward operating bases in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. They dug the latrines at Bagram Airfield. But this was just the warm-up. The real prize, the supergiant field of government contracting, was Iraq. Even as the dust was settling at Ground Zero, the neoconservative faction in the White House, led by Cheney, was already looking toward Baghdad, and Halliburton was looking with them. The company's executives knew that an invasion of Iraq would require a logistical effort dwarfing Vietnam. It would require rebuilding oil fields, constructing massive detention centers, and feeding an occupying army of 150,000 men. By the end of 2002, the die was cast. The Bush administration was marching toward war. Halliburton, utilizing its log cap vehicle, began to mobilize. They hired thousands of truck drivers, cooks, and mechanics, luring them with promises of tax-free six-figure salaries. They stockpiled equipment in Kuwait. They were ready to invade before the first shot was fired. The era of the war machine, 1962 to 2000, ended not with a whimper, but with the revving of diesel engines in the Kuwaiti desert. The company that Earl Halliburton had founded to cement oil wells had mutated into a paramilitary state, a fourth branch of the military that operated for profit. The stage was set for the tragedy of the Iraq War, where the cost-plus logic of Vietnam would be applied to the bloodiest conflict of the 21st century, and where the Halliburton dynasty would finally earn its reputation as the ultimate merchant of death. Electrocutions, rape, and toxic burn pits. The dawn of the 21st century brought with it the most lucrative and lethal opportunity in the history of the Halliburton dynasty. The company had spent the 1990s building the infrastructure of a private army, but it lacked a war to fight. That changed with the ascension of its former CEO, Dick Cheney, to the vice presidency of the United States. Halliburton, specifically its engineering subsidiary KBR, Kellogg Brown and Root, was waiting. Because of the groundwork Cheney had laid during his tenure as CEO, KBR held the LOGCAP-3 contract, a massive open-ended agreement with the U.S. Army to provide logistical support anywhere on Earth. It was a license to print money. But the real prize, the supergiant field of war profits, was Iraq. In the months leading up to the March 2003 invasion, while Vice President Cheney was on television warning of mushroom clouds and non-existent WMDs, his former colleagues at Halliburton were quietly securing the rights to the aftermath. In a secret no-bid process that bypassed all standard procurement rules, the Pentagon awarded KBR the RIO, Restore Iraqi Oil contract. This deal was worth up to $7 billion. It granted Halliburton the exclusive right to fight oil well fires and manage the Iraqi oil infrastructure after the invasion. The dynasty had effectively secured the contract to rebuild the country before the first bomb had even been dropped. As the invasion began on March 20th, 2003, a second army followed the tanks across the Kuwaiti border. This army did not wear camouflage. They wore KBR coveralls. They drove fuel trucks, built dining facilities, and dug latrines. To staff this private army, Halliburton launched a massive recruitment drive in the American heartland. They targeted truck drivers, mechanics, and laborers in economically depressed towns in Texas, Louisiana, and the Midwest. The pitch was seductive. Come to the Middle East, support the troops, and make $80,000 to $100,000 a year, tax-free. For men struggling to pay mortgages or child support, it was a life-changing offer. But the recruiters left out the most critical detail. They did not tell these civilians that they would be driving unarmored trucks through red zones controlled by insurgents. They did not tell them that they would not be issued weapons or body armor. They did not tell them that, in the eyes of the enemy, a KBR truck driver was a legitimate target. Halliburton was mobilizing a workforce of human shields. They were sending fathers and grandfathers into a meat grinder, unprotected by the Geneva Convention, to protect the profit margins of a cost-plus contract. The executives in Houston knew the risks. They had intelligence reports detailing the growing insurgency. But every truck that rolled, every gallon of fuel delivered was a billable event. The war machine was hungry, and it needed bodies to feed it. As 2003 turned into 2004, the insurgency in Iraq exploded. The liberation turned into a bloody occupation. The roads of Iraq became the most dangerous places on earth, lined with IEDs and ambush teams. The U.S. military began to armor its Humvees, but Halliburton's trucks remained soft-skinned targets, rolling coffins driven by men who believed they were safe because their recruiters had lied to them. The stage was set for a tragedy that would expose the true cost of privatization. On a dusty highway west of Baghdad, a convoy of Halliburton fuel tankers was about to be sent into a kill zone, sacrificed on the altar of logistical expediency. The Good Friday ambush was approaching, and it would prove that to the dynasty, a contractor's life was just another line item in the cost of doing business. The date, April 9th, 2004, marked the end of the phony war for the Halliburton contractors and the beginning of a slaughter. It was Good Friday. At Camp Anaconda, a sprawling U.S. air base north of Baghdad, a convoy of 19 fuel tankers and 2 military escort vehicles prepared to depart for Baghdad International Airport. The drivers were civilians, truckers from small towns in America who had signed up to make money for their families. They had been briefed by KBR managers that the route was green, military code for safe and secured. This was a lie. The route was red. The convoy, designated 725-04, rolled out onto the dusty highway into the heart of the Sunni Triangle. The drivers were unarmed. Their trucks were unarmored. They were driving thousands of gallons of highly flammable jet fuel through a war zone that had just days earlier erupted into a full-blown insurrection. The KBR managers knew the risks. Intelligence reports had flagged the route as a kill zone. But the pressure to deliver the fuel and to bill the government for the delivery overrode the safety of the men. As the convoy entered the town of Abu Ghraib, the trap was sprung. It was a massive, coordinated ambush. Insurgents armed with rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, and machine guns opened fire from the rooftops and alleyways. The lead vehicle was hit instantly. The fuel tankers, effectively rolling bombs, began to explode. The convoy disintegrated into a chaotic inferno of burning diesel and screaming metal. The drivers, trapped in their cabs, had no way to fight back. Stephen Hewlett, a 48-year-old from Missouri, was killed in his truck. Jack Montague, a 52-year-old from Illinois, was shot and killed. Tony Johnson, Jeffrey Parker, William Bradley, and Timothy Bell, all KBR employees, were slaughtered. But the horror did not end with the gunfire. The insurgents dragged some of the bodies from the wreckage. They desecrated them, looted them, and left them burning on the highway as a message to the invaders. One driver, Thomas Hamill, managed to crawl out of his burning truck. He was captured by insurgents, shot in the arm, and held hostage in a hole in the ground for weeks before escaping. The Good Friday ambush was a turning point. It shattered the illusion that contractors were non-combatants. It revealed the brutal calculus of the Halliburton business model. Civilians were cheaper to lose than soldiers. The military didn't have to write letters home to the families of contractors. The company did. and the company treated these deaths not as national tragedies, but as insurance claims. In the aftermath, the families of the dead drivers sued Halliburton. They argued that the company had knowingly sent their loved ones into a death trap to protect its profit margins. They produced emails showing that KBR managers had been warned about the danger, but ordered the convoy to proceed anyway. Halliburton's legal defense was a masterclass in cynicism. They argued that they were operating under the direction of the U.S. military, and therefore they were entitled to battlefield immunity. They claimed that a civilian court had no jurisdiction over decisions made in a war zone. For years, the company fought the widows of its own employees, dragging the case through the appellate courts until the families were exhausted. But the violence on the roads was only one way Halliburton was killing people. Inside the bases, a different kind of negligence was claiming lives. The rush to build massive bases like Camp Victory and Camp Anaconda led to shoddy, dangerous construction. Halliburton employed third country nationals, TCNs, laborers from India, the Philippines, and Nepal, who were paid pennies and often lacked proper training. In January 2008, Staff Sergeant Ryan Maseth, a 24-year-old Green Beret, stepped into the shower in his barracks at the Radwania Palace complex in Baghdad. The plumbing and electrical work had been installed and maintained by KBR. As Maseth turned on the water, a massive electrical current surged through the metal pipe. The grounding wire, which KBR was contractually obligated to install, was missing or improperly connected. Ryan Maseth was electrocuted to death in his own shower. His death was not an isolated incident. Investigations revealed that at least 18 U.S. soldiers had been electrocuted in Iraq due to faulty wiring in KBR-maintained facilities. Internal documents showed that KBR managers had been aware of the widespread electrical hazards for months. They had inspected the buildings, noted the lack of grounding, and done nothing. They had calculated that it was cheaper to risk the occasional electrocution than to rewire the entire base. When Ryan Maseth's mother sued KBR, the company used the same defense it had used against the truck drivers, combatant activities exception. They argued that the military was responsible for the buildings, not the contractor. They blamed the Army for not inspecting their work. This was the death of accountability. Halliburton had created a legal no man's land where they could profit from the war, but could not be held responsible for the casualties they caused. They were a private entity with the immunity of a sovereign state. But there was a third, even more pervasive way the company was killing people, a silent, slow-motion mass murder that would affect tens of thousands of veterans and contractors for decades to come. It was an environmental crime known as the burn pits. While soldiers were dying from electrocution in the showers and drivers were being incinerated on the highways, Halliburton was perpetrating a third, far more insidious crime against the American military, the burn pits. Under the massive log cap contract, KBR was responsible for waste disposal at nearly every U.S. base in Iraq and Afghanistan. The contract specified that waste should be disposed of safely, using incinerators that met environmental standards, but incinerators were expensive to ship and maintain in a war zone. KBR managers, looking to maximize their cost-plus margins and minimize logistical headaches, chose a cheaper, medieval solution. They dug massive open-air pits in the ground. Some, like the one at Joint Base Ballad, Camp Anaconda, were as large as 10 acres, a smoldering, toxic lake of trash that burned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Into these pits went everything the war produced: styrofoam, plastic water bottles, rubber tires, unexploded ordnance, batteries, medical waste, asbestos insulation, and even human body parts from the field hospitals. To ensure this wet, chaotic mess would burn, KBR employees doused the pits with thousands of gallons of JP-8 jet fuel and set them alight. The result was a chemical weapon deployed against America's own troops. The pits spewed a thick, black, acrid smoke that hung over the bases like a shroud. This smoke contained a witch's brew of carcinogens, dioxins, the same toxin found in Agent Orange, benzene, particulate matter, and neurotoxins. Soldiers sleeping in tents just a few hundred yards away woke up coughing up black goop. They developed Iraqi cough. But the real damage was happening at the cellular level. The toxins were embedding themselves in the lungs and brains of the young men and women who breathed the air. KBR knew the smoke was dangerous. Internal Air Force memos from as early as 2006 warned that the burn pit at Balad was an acute health hazard. But KBR did not stop. They argued that mission necessity required the pits. They continued to burn day and night for years. The body count of the burn pits is impossible to calculate precisely because it is a slow-motion massacre. It didn't kill soldiers instantly. It killed them 5, 10, or 15 years later. Veterans returned home only to develop rare and aggressive cancers, constrictive bronchiolitis, a terminal lung disease, and severe neurological disorders. Leroy Torres, a Texas state trooper and Army reservist, deployed to Balad in 2007. He came home with a lung disease that ended his career and left him gasping for breath. He sued KBR, becoming the face of a movement that exposed the company's negligence. But KBR fought back with the same legal shield they used in the electrocution cases, the political question doctrine. They argued that a court could not second-guess battlefield decisions made under the direction of the military. For a decade, this legal maneuver protected the dynasty from liability, leaving thousands of sick veterans to die without compensation, their lungs destroyed by the contractor their government had hired to support them. As the war dragged on into 2007 and 2008, the scandals surrounding KBR began to merge into a portrait of a company out of control. But one incident, perhaps more than any other, exposed the utter lawlessness of the Halliburton culture. It was not a story of war, but of sexual violence. In July 2005, a 19-year-old KBR employee named Jamie Lee Jones arrived in Baghdad. She was a civilian and administrative assistant. 4 days after her arrival, she was invited to a gathering in the company's living quarters in the Green Zone. She was given a drink. She woke up the next morning naked, bruised, and bleeding. She had been drugged and gang-raped by her fellow KBR employees. When she reported the assault to KBR management, they did not call the military police. They did not take her to a hospital. Instead, according to her testimony, they locked her in a shipping container. She was held there for 24 hours, guarded by armed men without food or water. They warned her that if she left the container, she would be arrested for violating orders. She was eventually rescued by a sympathetic State Department official who helped her get to a doctor and fly home. But when she tried to sue Halliburton in a U.S. court, she hit a legal brick wall that the company had quietly erected years earlier. Buried in the fine print of her employment contract was a mandatory arbitration clause. It stated that any dispute with the company, including allegations of sexual assault, had to be settled in a private, secret arbitration hearing, not in a public court. Halliburton argued that Jones had agreed to waive her right to a trial. The Jamie Lee Jones case became a national outrage. It exposed how Halliburton used legal fine print to silence victims and protect predators within its ranks. It revealed a corporate culture where the protection of the company's image was more important than the safety of its own employees. The dynasty had created a private justice system where rape was treated as an HR dispute. By 2007, the Halliburton brand was toxic. The name was synonymous with war profiteering, electrocution, burn pits, and rape. The shareholders were revolting. The stock price was suffering. The executives in Houston realized that the War Machine subsidiary, KBR, had become a liability that threatened to drag the entire oil empire down. So they decided to cut it loose. In April 2007, Halliburton announced it would spin off KBR into a separate, independent company. It was a strategic amputation. By severing ties with KBR, Halliburton hoped to inoculate itself against the looming wave of lawsuits and congressional investigations. They wanted to return to being a boring oil services company, leaving the bloody baggage of the Iraq War behind. Dick Cheney, the man who had engineered the merger, was still in the White House, shielded by executive privilege. The Halliburton family heirs were still cashing their checks. But the soldiers and contractors who had been electrocuted, poisoned, and raped were left to fight a ghost. The entity that had harmed them, Halliburton KBR, had split in two, creating a legal labyrinth designed to ensure that accountability would never be found. With KBR spun off, Halliburton hoped to leave the scandals of war behind and return to its roots as an energy company. But they carried the same reckless culture back to the oil fields. The war machine mentality, profit over safety, had infected the engineering DNA of the entire corporation. And as the new decade dawned, this negligence was about to trigger the worst environmental disaster in American history. As the Iraq War officially wound down with the U.S. withdrawal in 2011, the full scope of the tragedy came into focus. The Halliburton KBR era in Iraq had generated over $39.5 billion in revenue for the company. It was the most profitable war in corporate history, but the human balance sheet was a massacre. 718 contractors working for KBR and its subcontractors had died. 18 soldiers had been electrocuted in showers built by the company. Thousands of veterans and workers were coming home with lungs destroyed by the burn pits, coughing up their own tissue, dying slow deaths from rare cancers and constrictive bronchiolitis. And Jamie Lee Jones, the woman raped in the barracks, lost her civil suit against KBR in 2011, defeated by a legal team that painted her as promiscuous and the assault as consensual. The dynasty had survived the war. Dick Cheney, the architect, had retired to his estate in Wyoming, wealthy and unapologetic, having received a heart transplant in 2012 that extended his life while the soldiers he sent to war died of heart failure caused by toxic smoke. The Halliburton heirs continued to live in quiet luxury. The year 2014 marked the end of the era. The troops were gone, mostly. The lawsuits were settling or being dismissed. The war machine had done its job. It had extracted nearly $40 billion from the U.S. Treasury, left a broken country and a poisoned generation of veterans in its wake, and successfully severed the legal liability from the corporate asset. Halliburton was still a giant, still drilling, still cementing, but it was now a company haunted by a legion of ghosts. The truck drivers burning on the highway, the soldiers dying in the showers, and the roughnecks exploding in the Gulf, all sacrificed to feed the bottom line of a dynasty built on graves. Did Halliburton poison your water to save money? The Halliburton curse of putting profit over safety did not end in Iraq. It followed the company home. In April 2010, the company faced a catastrophe that would prove the war machine mentality had infected its oil operations as well. Halliburton was the contractor hired by BP to cement the Macondo well in the Gulf of Mexico. The job was critical. The cement was the final seal. But Halliburton managers ignored warnings that their foam cement mixture was unstable. On April 20th, 2010, the cement failed. The gas broke through, ignited, and destroyed the Deepwater Horizon rig. The explosion killed 11 men and unleashed the worst oil spill in U.S. history. In the aftermath, executives ordered a cover-up, deleting computer simulations that showed they knew the cement would fail. They eventually pleaded guilty to destroying evidence. But while the world watched the Gulf burn, Halliburton's executives were quietly navigating a separate, global legal minefield that threatened to expose them as criminally corrupt on a planetary scale. The focus of this new crisis was not in the U.S., but in the swamps of the Niger Delta. The scandal was known as TSKJ. For over a decade, Halliburton, through its KBR subsidiary, had been part of a 4-company consortium building a massive natural gas liquefaction plant on Bonny Island, Nigeria. The project was worth $6 billion, but to secure the contracts in one of the most corrupt nations on earth, the consortium had allegedly paid bribes on an industrial scale. The investigation, led by the U.S. Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, revealed a slush fund of over $180 million used to bribe Nigerian government officials. The money was funneled through shell companies in Gibraltar and the UK, paid to fixers, who then handed cash to ministers and politicians. In September 2008, Albert Jack Stanley, the former CEO of KBR and a longtime lieutenant of Dick Cheney, pleaded guilty to violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. He admitted to orchestrating the bribery scheme. Stanley was the man who had run Halliburton's operations in the Middle East. He was the architect of the cost-plus empire. His guilty plea was a direct strike at the heart of the dynasty's leadership. But the true body count of the TSKJ scandal was not in the courtroom. It was in the Niger Delta. The $180 million in bribes had propped up a corrupt Nigerian regime that systematically looted the country's oil wealth while leaving the people of the Delta in abject poverty. The money Halliburton paid to secure its gas plant directly fueled the patronage networks of politicians who used state security forces to crush local dissent. In the years following the scandal, 2010 to 2012, the violence in the Delta intensified. Militant groups, furious at the foreign exploitation and the environmental devastation caused by the gas flaring, and oil spills associated with projects like Bonny Island, attacked pipelines and kidnapped oil workers. The Nigerian military responded with brutal raids on villages. Halliburton's bribery had not just bought a contract, it had bought a war. The company's money had armed the very state forces that were killing civilians to protect the gas plant. In February 2009, KBR, now spun off but legally tethered to the crimes committed under Halliburton ownership, agreed to pay a $579 million fine to settle the charges. Halliburton itself paid nearly $300 million more to resolve civil complaints. But in 2012, the final act of the drama played out. Jack Stanley was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison. The image was striking. The former CEO of KBR, the man who had once commanded billions of dollars in Iraq contracts and flown on private jets with Dick Cheney, was handcuffed and led away to a federal penitentiary. It was a rare moment of accountability, but for the people of Bonny Island watching the gas flares burn night and day, poisoning their air and killing their fish, the prison sentence changed nothing. The bribes had been paid, the plant was built, and the poverty remained. While the Nigerian scandal was concluding, Halliburton was aggressively expanding its operations back home in the United States, pioneering a technology that would unleash a new wave of environmental and human health disasters: hydraulic fracturing, or fracking. Fracking involves blasting millions of gallons of water, sand, and chemicals deep underground to shatter shale rock and release natural gas and oil. It was the engine of the American energy renaissance. And Halliburton was the king of fracking. The company had invented the technology in the 1940s, but in the 2010s, they industrialized it. However, the chemicals used in the fracking fluid were secret. Halliburton refused to disclose them, claiming they were proprietary trade secrets. This secrecy was protected by a specific controversial piece of legislation passed in 2005, known as the Halliburton loophole. The loophole, inserted into the Energy Policy Act of 2005, a bill championed by Vice President Dick Cheney, explicitly exempted fracking from the Safe Drinking Water Act. It stripped the EPA of its authority to regulate the injection of fracking fluids into the ground. It was a legislative gift worth billions, effectively legalizing the potential poisoning of America's aquifers. By 2013, the consequences of the Cheney loophole were becoming visible in small towns across Pennsylvania, Texas, and Colorado. Residents living near Halliburton fracking sites began to report terrifying phenomena. Their tap water turned brown and smelled of chemicals. In some famous cases, homeowners could light their tap water on fire because it was so saturated with methane gas migrating from the fractured rock. But the fire water was just the spectacle. The real killer was invisible. The fracking fluids contained carcinogens like benzene and formaldehyde. Families reported chronic nosebleeds, mysterious rashes, and respiratory failure. Livestock on farms near the wells began to drop dead, their hair falling out, their bodies wasted. In Dymock, Pennsylvania, a town that became ground zero for the anti-fracking movement, residents sued Cabot Oil and Gas, a Halliburton client. But Halliburton, the service provider that actually pumped the chemicals, remained largely shielded by the loophole. The company aggressively fought any attempt to force disclosure. In 2014, when the EPA attempted to investigate water contamination in Wyoming, Halliburton and the industry lobbied furiously to kill the study. They succeeded. The EPA backed down. The fracking boom of the mid-2000s generated massive profits for Halliburton, reviving its stock price after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, but the cost was paid by rural Americans who found themselves living in a sacrifice zone. The company had brought the resource curse, usually reserved for places like Nigeria or Iraq, home to the American heartland. They were extracting wealth from the ground and leaving behind a legacy of poisoned water and dying cattle, protected by a law written by their former CEO. While Halliburton was poisoning the aquifers of Pennsylvania under the protection of the Cheney loophole, a different kind of poison was seeping through the company's corporate strategy. By 2014, the global price of oil began to wobble, and then, in 2015, it crashed. The boom was over. The frackers who had borrowed billions to drill wells in Texas and North Dakota went bankrupt. Halliburton, the service giant that relied on their business, faced a revenue cliff. The executives in Houston, led by CEO Dave Lassar, decided that the only way to survive the downturn was to eliminate their biggest rival. They set their sights on Baker Hughes. In November 2014, Halliburton announced it would acquire Baker Hughes for $34.6 billion. It was intended to be the merger of the century, creating an oil services duopoly that would dominate the planet. The combined entity would control nearly 50% of the U.S. fracking market. But the war machine had become too big. The U.S. Department of Justice, under the Obama administration, viewed the merger not as a business deal, but as an antitrust nightmare. They argued it would kill competition, drive up prices for consumers, and give Halliburton dangerous leverage over the U.S. energy supply. For 18 months, from 2015 to 2016, Halliburton fought the government. They spent millions on lawyers and lobbyists. They offered to sell off assets worth billions to appease regulators, but the DOJ held firm. In May 2016, the deal collapsed. The failure was a humiliation. Halliburton was forced to pay a $3.5 billion breakup fee to Baker Hughes, one of the largest penalties for a failed merger in history. The company had bet the farm and lost. To pay for this disaster, Halliburton turned on its own workforce. In 2016 and 2017, the company initiated a brutal wave of mass layoffs. Over 35,000 employees, nearly 40% of its global workforce, were fired. These were the roughnecks, the truck drivers, the cementers who had built the company's fortune during the fracking boom. They were discarded into an economy that had no place for them. The layoffs created a survivor culture of fear and exhaustion in the oil fields. Those who kept their jobs were forced to work longer hours with fewer resources. The safety culture, already damaged by the boom years, disintegrated completely. In the Permian Basin of Texas and the back-end fields of North Dakota, accident rates spiked. Men were crushed by pipe, burned by chemical explosions, and killed in fatigue-related driving accidents. The Halliburton curse of workplace death returned with a vengeance. But the most tragic toll was psychological. The oil patch communities devastated by the layoffs became ground zero for the deaths of despair. Suicide rates among oil workers surged. Opioid addiction, fueled by workplace injuries and economic hopelessness, ran rampant. Halliburton had extracted the wealth from the ground, and when the price dropped, they left behind ghost towns filled with unemployed, addicted men. As the decade closed, the ghosts of the Iraq War returned to haunt the company in a U.S. courtroom. The burn pit litigation, which had been stalled for years by Halliburton's political question defense, reached the Supreme Court in January 2019. The court declined to hear the case, effectively kicking it back to the lower courts. It was a procedural defeat for the veterans, but it kept the issue alive. The legal battle ground on. Veterans like Leroy Torres, gasping for breath, continued to die while Halliburton's lawyers filed motions to dismiss. The contrast was stark. In 2019, Halliburton reported revenue of $22 billion. Its executives flew on private jets. Its former CEO, Dick Cheney, lived in comfortable retirement. But the soldiers who had breathed the smoke of the burn pits were organizing bake sales to pay for their chemotherapy. The war machine had successfully privatized the profit of war, but it had socialized the cost. The dying veterans were the externalized liability of the Halliburton business plan. As 2020 arrived, bringing with it the global shock of the COVID-19 pandemic, Halliburton faced a new crisis. The oil price crashed to negative territory in April 2020. The drilling stopped. The company lost $3 billion in the first quarter alone. But in the chaos, the company saw an opportunity to clean house. They used the pandemic as cover to lay off thousands more workers and to shut down underperforming facilities. They streamlined the operation, shedding the last vestiges of the family atmosphere that Earl Halliburton had once tried to cultivate. The company that emerged from the pandemic in 2021 was leaner, meaner, and more automated. It was a digital oil field services company, reliant on AI and remote monitoring, reducing the need for human roughnecks. The Iron Man era was truly over. The machines had taken over, and the humans, the workers, the soldiers, the civilians, were simply collateral damage in the algorithm of extraction. While Halliburton was ruthlessly streamlining its workforce during the pandemic, A toxic secret that had been buried for a decade was beginning to bubble up from the ground in the American heartland. The Halliburton loophole of 2005 had allowed the company to hide the ingredients of its fracking fluid, treating the chemical recipe as a proprietary state secret. But in 2021, a landmark report by Physicians for Social Responsibility finally cracked the code. The report, titled "Fracking with Forever Chemicals," revealed a terrifying truth. Between 2012 and 2020, Halliburton and other oil service companies had pumped millions of pounds of PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, into oil and gas wells across the United States. PFAS are known as forever chemicals because they never break down in the environment. They bioaccumulate in the human body. Even in microscopic amounts, they are linked to kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid disease, and birth defects. Halliburton had used these chemicals to make their fracking fluid slicker, to make the oil flow faster. They had injected them directly into the water tables of rural communities in Texas, Pennsylvania, and Colorado. The revelation changed the nature of the fracking debate from an environmental argument into a public health emergency. In counties where Halliburton operated heavily, doctors were seeing unexplained clusters of rare cancers in children. In Washington County, Pennsylvania, dozens of children living near fracking sites were diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma, a rare and deadly bone cancer. Parents watched their children die, their bones eaten away by disease, while the company that operated the wells refused to disclose what chemicals they were using. The loophole protected Halliburton from liability. They argued successfully in court that they could not be sued for poisoning the water if the plaintiffs couldn't prove exactly which secret chemical caused the cancer. It was a perfect circular defense. We won't tell you what we poisoned you with, so you can't prove we poisoned you. This was the corruption of the world brought home. The same disregard for human life that Halliburton had shown in the burn pits of Iraq and the gas plants of Nigeria was now being applied to the farmers and families of Pennsylvania. The company viewed the American countryside not as a community, but as a resource extraction zone. While the chemical scandal was unfolding in the U.S., the company's international division was finalizing the paperwork on yet another bribery scandal, this time in Angola. The Angolan settlement, finalized with the SEC in July 2017 and reverberating through the company's compliance departments into the 2020s, was a stark reminder that the war machine had not changed its stripes. It had just changed continents. The SEC investigation found that Halliburton had paid over $3.7 million to a local Angolan company to satisfy local content requirements. In reality, the local company was owned by a former Halliburton employee who was a close friend of a high-ranking official at Sonangol, the state-owned oil company. The money was a bribe, plain and simple. It was the price of entry to drill in Angola's lucrative Deepwater fields. The penalty? Halliburton agreed to pay $29.2 million in fines and disgorgement. To the average observer, $29 million sounds like a punishment. To Halliburton, which generates that amount in revenue roughly every 12 hours, it was a transaction fee. It was a toll booth on the road to billions. The company did not admit wrongdoing. No executives went to prison. They simply wrote a check and went back to drilling. The Angolan people, meanwhile, saw none of the benefit. Angola remains one of the poorest countries in the world, despite its oil wealth. The money Halliburton paid did not build schools. It built villas for the corrupt elite in Luanda. The Halliburton curse in Africa was a cycle of extraction and impoverishment, greased by bribery and protected by American lawyers. As 2022 dawned, the geopolitical landscape shifted again, offering Halliburton a new massive opportunity for profit amidst human misery. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The war sent oil prices skyrocketing to over $100 a barrel. For Halliburton, this was the signal to restart the engines. The drilling rigs in the Permian Basin, which had been idle during the pandemic, roared back to life. The stock price surged. But the war also presented a moral dilemma. Halliburton had a significant presence in Russia. They had thousands of employees there, helping the Russian state oil giant Gazprom drill the wells that funded Vladimir Putin's war machine. In the weeks following the invasion, as Russian bombs fell on Ukrainian hospitals and schools, the world demanded that Western companies pull out of Russia. McDonald's left, Starbucks left. BP and Shell announced they were exiting. Halliburton hesitated. For weeks, the company stayed silent, continuing to service the Russian oil fields. Every barrel of oil they helped pump put money directly into the Kremlin's war chest. Critics accused Halliburton of being a sponsor of war. They argued that the company's technology was essential to the Russian economy, and by staying, they were complicit in the slaughter of civilians in Mariupol and Bucha. It wasn't until March 18, 2022, nearly a month into the war, and only after intense pressure from sanctions and the public, that Halliburton finally announced it would wind down its operations in Russia. But the exit was not a moral stand. It was a business calculation. They sold their Russian assets to a local management team. The technology, the equipment, and the expertise remained in Russia, continuing to pump oil for Putin. Halliburton had effectively transferred its war-making capability to the enemy, washing its hands of the responsibility while ensuring the oil kept flowing. This was the definitive portrait of the dynasty in the 2020s, a corporation that poisoned American children with forever chemicals, bribed African dictators for contracts, and hesitated to stop funding a genocidal war until the sanctions made it impossible to stay. The war machine had no flag, no loyalty, and no conscience. It had only a mandate to drill. As 2023 unfolded, Halliburton stood at the center of a global energy crisis that was generating windfall profits not seen since the Iraq War. The conflict in Ukraine had severed Europe's gas lines from Russia, creating a desperate, panic-driven demand for American LNG, liquefied natural gas. The fracking rigs in Texas and Pennsylvania serviced by Halliburton were running 24 hours a day. The company reported annual revenue of $23 billion, a surge that signaled the war machine was back in its prime. But while the shareholders celebrated the dividend hikes, a final bitter chapter was being written for the victims of the company's previous war. For 15 years, the veterans exposed to the burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan had been fighting a two-front war, one against the cancer eating their lungs, and one against KBR/Halliburton in the federal courts. By 2023, the legal war was effectively over, and the company had won. Despite years of legal battles, the Supreme Court's refusal to hear the case cemented Halliburton's battlefield immunity, shifting the burden entirely onto the American taxpayer. The burden of this corporate negligence was shifted entirely onto the American taxpayer. In August 2022, President Biden signed the PACT Act, a historic piece of legislation that expanded VA benefits for burn pit victims. It allocated $280 billion of public money to treat the cancers and respiratory diseases caused by the toxic smoke. This was the final grotesque accounting of the privatization of war. Halliburton had been paid billions to manage the waste. They had done it cheaply and dangerously to maximize profit. And now The citizens were paying billions more to heal the soldiers Halliburton had broken. The company had successfully privatized the gains and socialized the casualties. While the veterans were dying in VA hospitals, Halliburton was facing a new kind of death scandal in the American heartland. The PFAS, or Forever Chemical, contamination crisis, which had begun as a murmur in rural communities, had exploded into a nationwide legal firestorm. Throughout 2023, lawsuits filed by water districts and municipalities across the United States began to target the oil field services giants. They alleged that the fracking fluids injected by Halliburton had permanently poisoned the aquifers. In small towns in West Texas and Oklahoma, rates of rare cancers and birth defects were spiking. Families were watching their livestock die and their children get sick, trapped on land where the water was undrinkable. Halliburton's defense was consistent with its history: deny, delay, and obfuscate. They fought the release of chemical formulas. They argued that the chemicals came from other sources: firefighting, foam, or Teflon pans, anything but their wells. They used their immense lobbying power to fight EPA regulations that would designate PFAS as hazardous substances. The corruption of the world had come full circle. The company that had begun in 1919 by sealing oil wells to prevent blowouts was now, a century later, accused of blowing out the ecological safety of the planet. They were facilitating the extraction of fossil fuels at a rate that climate scientists warned was a death sentence for the atmosphere, while simultaneously poisoning the local water of the communities where they operated. As the year ended, Halliburton was a fortress of impunity. It had survived the bribery scandals of Nigeria and Angola with mere fines. It had survived the Deepwater Horizon disaster with a plea deal. It had survived the Iraq War lawsuits with total immunity. It was a corporate entity that had seemingly evolved beyond the reach of human law, a machine designed to extract resources and leave behind only holes in the ground and ghosts in the air. The conclusion of the Halliburton saga in the year 2023 is a testament to the resilience of a business model built on moral hazard. The company had weathered every scandal, paid every fine, and buried every body, emerging not as a pariah, but as a blue-chip investment. The final act of this era was a quiet financial transaction that perfectly encapsulated the dynasty's philosophy of profit without presence. In July 2023, Halliburton agreed to pay a final settlement to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, regarding the Angola bribery scandal. The fine was $29.2 million. To a company that had just reported quarterly revenue of $5.8 billion. This was mathematically insignificant, less than 2 days of operating income. The settlement allowed Halliburton to close the books on the African corruption investigation without admitting guilt. It was the final piece of the legal cleanup strategy. The company had now resolved its liabilities for the Nigeria bribes, the Deepwater Horizon explosion, the Iraq War overcharging, and the Angola kickbacks. Each resolution had come with a check, but never with a handshake of handcuffs. The executives who had authorized the bribes, cut the safety corners, and ordered the burn pits lit were all free men, retired to their ranches and yachts. This lack of personal accountability sent a chilling message to the global energy sector. Corruption works. If you bribe a dictator and get a $1 billion contract and then get fined $29 million 10 years later, you haven't been punished. You've been taxed. The crime is profitable. As the year ended, Halliburton was looking forward, not backward. The company was aggressively positioning itself for the next great conflict. With tensions rising in the Middle East following the October 7th attacks in Israel and the war in Ukraine grinding into a stalemate, the war machine was once again indispensable. Governments around the world were scrambling for energy security and military infrastructure. Halliburton, with its unique ability to operate in conflict zones and extract oil from the most difficult geologies, was the first call for every desperate ministry of defense and energy. The dynasty had successfully navigated the transition from the Cheney era of direct political control to the modern era of technocratic immunity. They no longer needed a vice president in the White House. They just needed a world in chaos. And the 21st century was delivering chaos in abundance. The corruption of the world was complete. Halliburton had helped to break the nations of Iraq and Libya. It had poisoned the water of America. It had bribed the governments of Africa. And it had done it all while generating hundreds of billions of dollars for its shareholders. The company stood as a monument to the idea that there is no problem, legal, ethical, or environmental, that cannot be solved with enough money and enough cement. Who really paid the price for the Halliburton dynasty? The corporate history of Halliburton is a ledger written in the ink of profit and loss. But the family history, the story of the bloodline that gave the company its name, is written in the ink of sudden death and lingering illness. The curse that began with Earl P. Halliburton in 1957 did not end with his plane crash. It echoed through the generations, a genetic tremor that seemed to punish the men who wielded the company's power. The most prominent heir, Earl Halliburton Jr., spent his life trying to escape the shadow of his father. He retreated into a world of quiet luxury, collecting art and racing yachts, desperate to distance himself from the grime of the oil patch. But he could not escape the legacy. He lived to see the company his father built transform into a machine of war in Vietnam and Iraq. He lived to see the name Halliburton become a slur at protest marches. He died in 2004 just as the carnage in Iraq was reaching its peak. His death was quiet, a fading away in a hospital room, a stark contrast to the fiery public deaths of the men who worked for his family's company in the desert. But the true personal tragedy of the Halliburton leadership is found in the man who wasn't born a Halliburton, but who became its most infamous king, Dick Cheney. The irony was Shakespearean. The man who had sent thousands of young, healthy Americans to die in the burn pits of Iraq, men who would return with destroyed lungs and failing hearts, was given a new heart to extend his own life. He received the ultimate gift of survival, while the soldiers he commanded were denied disability benefits by the government he led. Cheney's survival is a testament to the power of modern medicine, but it is also a symbol of the inequality of the Halliburton legacy. The executives get transplants, the soldiers get cancer. The war machine consumes the bodies of the poor to sustain the lives of the rich. As of 2024, the Halliburton family name has largely vanished from the public sphere. The heirs are dispersed, their fortune diluted by generations of inheritance. They are no longer captains of industry. They are merely wealthy individuals living in the quiet enclaves of Texas and California, their connection to the company reduced to a stock ticker symbol. The dynasty has disintegrated. The Iron Man has no successor. But the Halliburton entity remains, a corporate zombie that has outlived its creators. It is a company without a soul, a machine that exists only to drill and to bill. It has shed the family identity completely, replacing it with the cold anonymity of a multinational conglomerate. The physical legacy of the family, the mansions, the yachts, the private jets, is fading. But the human legacy remains vivid in the cemeteries of America and Iraq. It is found in the graves of the 11 men on the Deepwater horizon. It is found in the unmarked plots of the Nigerian villagers killed by security forces paid with Halliburton bribes. And it is found in the VA hospitals where veterans of the Iraq War take their last rattling breaths. The Halliburton curse was never about a ghost or a spell. It was about the simple, brutal arithmetic of a business that valued concrete more than flesh. The family is gone, but the concrete coffin they built is still open, waiting for the next war, the next oil boom, and the next generation of men willing to die for a paycheck. The disintegration of the Halliburton dynasty's reputation is mirrored by the disintegration of the world order it helped to create. The war on terror, fueled by Cheney's doctrine of preemptive strike and Halliburton's doctrine of privatized logistics, has left a legacy of instability that stretches from the ruins of Mosul to the refugee camps of Europe. The company's role in this geopolitical unraveling is not a footnote, it is a central chapter. By monetizing chaos, Halliburton created a feedback loop where instability generated profit, and profit incentivized more instability. This legacy of cynicism has deeply infected American political culture. The revolving door between Halliburton and the White House, personified by Dick Cheney, shattered the public's trust in government. It validated the conspiracy theories of the cynical, that wars are fought not for freedom, but for oil contracts. The phrase "no blood for oil," once a protest slogan, became a historical verdict. In 2024, Halliburton operates as a sleek, technocratic giant, its PR department working tirelessly to greenwash its image with talk of carbon capture and sustainable drilling. But the ghost cannot be exorcised. The company faces a future where its past crimes, the bribery in Nigeria, the poisoning in Pennsylvania, the electrocutions in Iraq, are not just historical facts, but legal precedents that will shape corporate liability for decades. The ultimate tragedy of the Halliburton story is the betrayal of the founder's original vision. Earl P. Halliburton started his company to save lives, to stop the dangerous blowouts that killed roughnecks. A century later, his company has become an engine that consumes lives. The Iron Man built a business on the mastery of concrete. His successors built an empire on the mastery of corruption. The concrete coffin is sealed, but the ledger is still open, recorded in the lungs of the dying, in the history of a century stained by oil and blood.